This is the Mazima Podcast.
Welcome to this Twitter space from wherever you're listening in. From West Africa, Karibu, welcome. From East Africa, you're very welcome. From South Africa, from across the world, and wherever you're listening in. My name is Solomon Serwanja. I am an investigative journalist and I lead the team at the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. I am really thrilled to have all of us discuss what is going on in Africa, especially what has been happening in Kenya. For those of you who perhaps may not have been following what's happening in Kenya, here is a just quick roundup of the protests that have been happening over the last couple of weeks, some lessons just to help us understand, and then later we'll come up with the context and lessons that we learn from Kenya. I'll then come back to introduce my panelists, but take a listen to just this brief to give you and paint for you a picture of what's been happening.
In Kenya, people are protesting against a new finance bill that introduces unpopular tax proposals, igniting widespread anger across the nation. Demonstrators are upset with the bill, which President William Ruto argues is necessary to address heavy public debt. The controversial bill contains provisions seen as imposing extra burdens on ordinary citizens and businesses, sparking an outcry from a public already struggling with the high cost of living. Although the Kenyan government has withdrawn some of the contentious proposals, so far it has done little to alleviate public anger.
Yeah, because look at what's happening. Young Kenyans are demonstrating for their rights. They're demonstrating with flags and banners. I can't even see anymore. They're being tear gassed. They're being
The finance bill was introduced in Parliament earlier in May 2024 and faced intense debate last week, with opposition lawmakers supporting the angry protesters. The following is a summary of what the bill originally proposed. The initial provisions of the bill included a plan to introduce a 16% sales tax on bread and a 25% duty on cooking oil. Additionally, there was a proposed increase in the tax on financial transactions and a new annual tax on vehicle ownership amounting to 2.5% of the vehicle's value. In response to the public outcry, the government announced it would drop these measures. Another proposal in the bill was the eco-levy, intended as a charge on products contributing to e-waste and environmental harm. Critics argued that the eco-levy would increase the cost of essential items such as sanitary pads, which was considered as being largely insensitive given that many girls unable to afford these products often miss school during their periods. Babies' nappies would also be affected by the eco-levy. Following public outcry, the government announced that the levy would apply only to imported products, arguing that this would boost the growth of local industries. Another primary focus of this eco-levy is digital products such as mobile phones, cameras, recording equipment, TVs, and radio devices. An increase in the cost of these products is viewed as detrimental to the growth of Kenya's digital economy, which many people depend on for their livelihoods. Lastly, the bill also suggests raising the import tax rate from 2.5% to 3% of the item's value payable by the importer at the port. This increase comes just a year after the rate was lowered from 3.5% to 2.5%. Some people in Kenya argued that the bill exacerbates existing hardships coming amidst rising food and living expenses and following previous tax hikes in 2023. They contend that these taxes would drive up overall living costs.
And of course, as a result of the pressure that came in from the citizens, and of course the protests that were led by the Gen Z, the president of Kenya made several recommendations. The pressure is too much. Here is just a sneak peek in what President Ruto, addressing the media recently on the decisions that his government took as a result of the pressure that was coming in from the citizens. Take a listen.
And President William Ruto has constituted a presidential task force on forensic audit of public debt. The task force will be chaired by Nancy Onyango and will comprise, among others, President of LSK, Faith Odhiambo, Institute of Certified Public Accountants Chairperson Philip Kaikai, and Engineer Shama Kiteme, the President of the Institute of Engineers of Kenya. The task force will be required to undertake their duty for 3 months.
Public debt is and continues to be a major point of engagement and conversation in Kenya. I have today appointed an independent task force to carry out a comprehensive forensic audit of our public debt and report to us in the next 3 months. This audit will provide the people of Kenya with clarity on the extent and nature of our debt, how public resources have been expended, and will also recommend proposals for managing our public debt in a manner that is sustainable and does not burden future generations.
Well, that's President William Ruto there speaking at a press conference that was held at State House. He made several recommendations on how they can cut down on the expenditure. This was welcomed by many in Kenya, but also some thought that, well, it's just politicking. But let's see how it comes. On this space this evening, I'm really excited to introduce my panelists to discuss about the right to protests lessons in Kenya. Where I come from here, when we protest, it's a different picture altogether. We have different speakers today on the space. I'm excited to have Nicholas Opiyo. Nicholas Opiyo is a human rights lawyer. He's a citizen of East Africa. He's also the executive director at Chapter 4, joining us from Uganda. Nicholas, thank you so much for being part of the conversation today. Nick, it's good to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Solomon, and hello, citizens, comrades, and fellow Africans. I look forward to this discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot, Nick. We also have John-Allan Namu. John-Allan is a co-founder of African Censored. He's a celebrated investigative journalist, and my very good friend John is speaking to us live from Nairobi. John, karibu sana. Welcome to this space.
Asante sana, Solo. I hope everyone can hear me, and thanks for inviting me.
All right. Thanks a lot, John. We also are privileged to be joined by Hopewell Chin'ono, who is an investigative journalist and filmmaker from Zimbabwe. Hopewell, very, very welcome. Thank you so much for accepting to also share with us on this space.
Thank you very much, my brother Solomon, for inviting me. I look forward to learning.
All right. Thanks a lot. We'll be joined later on by Ruth Sekindi, who is the director at the Uganda Human Rights Commission. She'll be joining us, as well as Robert Kirenga, who is the executive director at the National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders, as we continue. All right, John, firstly, what do you make of the protests? How did these protests yield such tremendous results? And I'm speaking about this because we've had several protests in Uganda where, people have come and walked on the streets, and we haven't gotten much results from these protests. We have had walk-to-work protests that were led by, Dr. Kizza Besigye and the opposition at the time. We've had protests on corruption that were led by civil society. We've had protests in this country, indeed, but it hasn't been to the level at which Kenya has had it. So what has led to the success of these protests in terms of organization, in terms of the people's right to demonstrate? Perhaps you could maybe start us there and ground us on these protests, how they came around and how they have been a success in Kenya. John, you're welcome.
Okay, Solo, that's a big question. The protests are a product of a continuum of actions and events that have taken place in Kenya. So to understand the genesis, you'd have to go all the way back to 2010, right, when the Constitution was promulgated. But that's a long story. So I'll just cut to the chase with these current protests. The reason why the protests, in my view, were, in quote unquote successful was the distributed nature of the protests. The fact that this wasn't a protest, that was it may have been called by a few people, but it really was owned by a large number of people, and by that I mean it's the youth and the people of Kenya. Now that these protests happen in 35 counties tells you something about the nature and the unanimity with which the problems that people associated with the finance bill have been taken. So I think that's the one thing. It's the unanimity of I guess anger and against the finance bill, but you scratch beneath the surface. This is really something deeper, in my view, right? This is something a lot deeper than just the current problems that we face. And whereas there's some voices who said that had public participation towards with the finance bill been listened to sufficiently by government in the weeks before the bill was passed, then we wouldn't have gotten to this point. I say yes. I mean, perhaps the finance bill wouldn't have been the trigger, but somewhere down the road, this was coming, and I guess that's part of the reason why they've been so sustained, and the anger that a lot of Kenyans have demonstrated towards the government has been sustained. Now, speaking to success, this is where I think, interestingly, when some of the protests were taking place, Martin Luther King's son, Martin Luther King Jr., was in the country, and I'm not trying to reach for any sort of like correlations, but it was interesting. It was just like an interesting anecdote, because the peaceful nature of the protests completely confounded a security state that is used to dealing with protests in one way, right? And despite the provocations, especially in the first round of the police, the protests were largely peaceful, and that I think struck a chord with a lot of people. It struck a chord because it was very clear and was very stark where the provocations were coming from. It was very clear that there were very specific things that were being called for in the protest, and yet there was no real response. And then I think the third thing that happened that has sustained the energy around this have been the pronouncements of leaders, not just the president, but leaders in advance of the protest. Very arrogant, incredibly high-handed, and completely tone deaf to what was being said. If you look at the transcript from some of the public participation sessions, you will see that this protest against the finance bill was coming from all sectors of society, right? And this is something that I think was either missed deliberately or by design. And this is what has led us to where we are today. Obviously, things are still very fluid. There's a lot of things, that you can't really read the tea leaves as to what's happening and what will happen next. But I think everybody can agree that this is an existential moment in Kenya's history, and perhaps a harbinger of what could happen across the continent, given just how, and I'm not saying this with any arrogance, but how influential events in Kenya have been on events elsewhere on the continent. Solo.
Well, certainly, there's tomorrow, the 11th and the 12th of July, there will be a march in Zimbabwe. And there's a Rise Up Zimbabwe march that is going to happen in Zimbabwe. We know that on the 23rd of July, there's going to be a march to Parliament here in Uganda. There's going to be a march in Lagos, Nigeria. So you're justified to say that the Kenyan protests have had a significant impact on the African continent. But John, let me just stay with you a little bit. This turned out to be more of the citizenry. This was not like those rallies or those demonstrations that are organized by maybe politicians, opposition politicians, or even civil society. This was young people from wherever they were having an organic movement that seemed like, in your view, like this bill was a tip-off. Like they were so tired of what was happening and they decided to get on the front line and fight for what they believe is theirs. What lessons do we learn in terms of getting to that point where people take it up upon themselves to lead a movement such as strong like this, John?
Well, I don't want to be too fatalistic about this, but this is kind of like the self-fulfilling prophecy of some of the statements about the youth bulge in Africa, right? Now, when people say that this was a protest led by young people, they're right? But when people try and characterize this as a movement of young people as a subset and maybe like a minor subset of the population, this is where they're wrong, right? And this has been my point about these protests. Kenya's population, just like Africa's, is incredibly young. We are one of the youngest, if not the youngest continents on earth, right? Our median age is 19.9 here in Kenya. I believe Uganda is even younger, right? The average, or rather over 70% of the population in Kenya is below 35 years of age, right? So these are people who are just getting into their most productive phase of their lives. And what do they find? They find a train wreck and a trail of disastrous decisions made by governments before them, a legacy of impunity and corruption that has not only, not been mitigated against fully, but has been able to fester. And in Kenya's case specifically, over the past 10 years, right? And third, this monster called debt. And you see, this is not just Kenya's problem alone. I was doing a couple of stories about Kenya's journey towards its debt crisis. And in so doing, I looked up how many countries had taken up Eurobonds, commercial loans across Africa at the time that Kenya was taking theirs up. And it was about between 11 and 15, right? Look at the number of countries in Africa who are struggling with this debt. But look deeper now to the kind of misgovernance and misappropriation of that debt that has led, countries to this position. Ghana had, protests in 2023 around its central bank, typically, and in as much as the situation in Ghana is different, a lot of the underlying factors are the same. Young population, leadership that was incredibly, playing fast and loose with the public funds, leading to a situation where the country itself was facing debt distress. Zambia very narrowly avoided some of the worst of these kinds of protests through an election where a president, seemed fairly decisive around the kinds of steps that they were going to take. But if you look at some of the factors that have led to the protests in Kenya, there is very rich ground for those kinds of things to happen elsewhere. Now, I have to hasten to say that not every country, obviously, Africa is not a country. And the situation in Uganda is not the situation in Kenya. The context and the history of Zimbabwe is not ours. So there are many steps along this journey that perhaps Kenya has gone on that other countries may not. But it certainly is worth thinking about, given the age of our population and given the kind of frustrations that our youthful population face. But finally, I think this is one of the most important things. It's a fact that a lot of Kenyans have access to not just the internet, but are incredibly adept at using the internet, not just to communicate, right? Not just to be on Twitter Spaces, but to be able to broaden their horizons and see what's happening around the world. And what they see around the world is other contexts in which good leadership has good outcomes, right? And if you listen to some of like the deeper, or rather some of the more well-researched and well-thought-out points that some of the people who've been talking in support of these protests have been saying, you realize that they are looking and really reading the situation for what it is. So that, I think, is part of the reason why we have this situation continuing. And the final thing I'll say is the African leadership that we have on the continent, largely, in broad strokes, is very similar in how it looks at and projects itself on its public, right? It is a power to be feared, respected, and to be heard, and it chooses when to listen. Now, in spite of the fact that there have been waves across the continent that have bucked this trend, this largely has been the modus of African leadership, African government. What Kenya's protests have done also is sweep aside some of the assumptions that have been created because of these kinds of systems, right? That we vote tribally, that we can only emerge onto the streets if we are led, and so on and so forth. This is really a moment to really ponder upon in terms of the direction that Africa takes. Sub-Saharan Africa, I should say, at least.
Thanks, John. Just last one, and then I can come to my other panelists. John, you've mentioned about it that the reason why people go to the streets is because they feel they are not being heard, that there is no any other way to have their voices heard. That even when, the Kenyans said no to this bill, Parliament went ahead and actually passed the bill. It has taken lives to be lost on the streets, and all these protests, and the takeover of Parliament, the burning up of the Justice Department, and all the protests and the destruction of businesses owned by politicians across Kenya, to have the president to listen and therefore constitute his government to make significant recommendations. I wanted you to speak a little bit about that, but also the element of that it's our right to protest. I think there's also that, which is important, that it's our right to go on the streets and protest if they do not listen to us. And I think that the Kenyans have had that. I mean, we know about the Maandamano, that has been happening, that was led by Baba Raila Odinga. In the previous past, we've had Kenyans on the streets. So the common denominator there is Kenyans understand that even when there is a government in power, they clearly understand that they have a right to go out there and express themselves in how they are governed. I just wanted you to also speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So one of the first, if not the first articles in the Constitution is about the exercising of power and the sovereignty of, Kenya's sovereignty and who it rests with. Kenyans have taken that seriously. And I remember I told you that this sort of tracks back to, August of 2010, when we promulgated the new constitution. So an academic and scholar, Darius Okola, calls that the ushering in of the Second Republic. And he puts it really succinctly, right? So there are a number of power structures and individuals who still live in the Kenya prior to 2010, when that constitution was passed. But some of these institutions are now, rotting away and rusting away. And the true appreciation of the Constitution and what it means has been taken up by a generation of people who believed in the promise of that, of that sovereignty. That the laws that they have in place, first of all, were very hard fought, because that part of Kenya's history is very storied, right? The laws that we have in our Constitution were very, very hard won. And just going back to our history. And I think there's a very deep appreciation for that. But you see, you cannot live in a country where your laws say one thing and your reality says something else, right? It'll always come to that moment when, whether you have a history of protest or not, right? It'll always come to that moment when you are facing two completely contradictory realities. The law says something, but the police, as an example, act in another way. The law says something, but our leaders act in direct contravention of the law. The last regime was an exemplar of that, right? I'd mentioned in a video that I posted recently, just reminding Kenyans of the number of court orders that were completely snubbed by our internal security minister, by our attorney general, by a raft of the most senior members of government, right? And then because there'd been, I guess, a lot of apathy around the last election in terms of voting, the assumption was that then people have given up on Kenya. But I think this finance bill was kind of like a trigger and a step too far. But in terms of why it is that the organization has happened like this, the success, etc., it's really a story of the legacy of protest, the fights that we fought, some lost, some won, to get to the point where we have laws that represent our aspirations. What now hasn't happened is that we don't have leadership, right? At least this is what the protesters are saying. We don't have leadership that conforms to those aspirations. And not only are they doing that, are they not conforming to those aspirations, they, in many ways, are architects of the potential downfall of the country in a few years, directly impacting the lives of Kenyans across the country. So that's kind of where we are, Solo.
All right, thanks a lot. I'll come back to you. Someone just said here, Solomon, opportunity politicians took advantage and also rode on the protests. Dr. Miguna used X to analyze complex hidden implications. We'll get to that, John, but thanks. Stay with me. Today, there was a demonstration in Lusaka, Zambia. As young activists went on the streets, they were all arrested. There will be a demonstration tomorrow on the 11th and the 12th of in Zimbabwe. And of course, on the 23rd in Uganda, in Kampala. Perhaps let me bring in Hopewell. Hopewell, let me bring you in here. Tomorrow, young people and people from Zimbabwe will be going to the streets. What lessons do you draw from what has been happening in Kenya as the country organizes for these demonstrations and protests? Hopewell, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Solomon, for having me. It's great to be here. I see some great names, people that I admire, like Dr. Stella Nyanzi, who are also here. We've been learning from them for years. I think the difference that we have, it relates to the evolution of our politics in East Africa and in Southern Africa. In Zimbabwe, we are where you were with Daniel Arap Moi in East Africa around the 90s. Draconian rules, draconian laws, abuse of state power, rampant corruption, the killing of political opponents, the capture of the judiciary, the capture of the police service, and how the whole nation is cowed into fear and are afraid to go out and exercise their rights. So, for instance, in Zimbabwe, we have Section 59 of the Constitution, which says that citizens can go out to protest peacefully and to petition the government. The ZANU-PF government, especially under Emerson Mnangagwa, is not counted as that. They've refused to accept that. When people tried to demonstrate in 2018 on the 1st of August, after our election, the first election after the removal of Robert Mugabe through the military coup, about 6 Zimbabweans were killed with live ammunition. I know that a lot of Zimbabweans, from that time, they became so terrified of going into the streets. And each time when somebody talks about demonstrating and reminds everybody that this is a constitutional right, they are reminded of what happened. And I'm not so sure about how the Kenyans have dealt with what I'm about to say now. In Zimbabwe, it has been made worse because there are certain elements within the opposition that have been captured. by the regime in Harare. There are people in the media supposedly independent, but they are captured. There are subtle messages that are sent out there that, you will be killed if you go onto the streets. There are people who deliberately go out there, misinform the public, and instill these messages of fear into the hearts of people to say, you can't do this. And when we looked at what happened in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, demonstrations were the preserve of political parties. Going back, I think, the past 24 years. It was the preserve of political parties, the opposition going into the streets under Morgan Tsvangirai. When Morgan Tsvangirai died, that culture also died. The current main opposition leader said he doesn't want to go into the streets. He will get people killed. And so when people saw what happened in Kenya, a lot of Zimbabweans thought this was a refreshing way of doing things where you don't have to rely on political parties. You don't have to rely on politicians because they cut deals. They are corrupt both in the opposition and in the ruling party. They are more interested in their own power. They are more interested in staying in power, and those in the opposition are more interested in having a foothold on the feeding trough. So the Kenyan model, I think, is going to be very attractive to a lot of young people. My good friend Alan Namu mentioned that the median age, I think, is 19 or 20 in Kenya. The median age in Zimbabwe is 17 years old. So we have a very young population who are restive. 95% of our potential workforce is at home. Hospitals do not work. Corruption, the same things that triggered the demonstrations in Kenya are there in abundance in Zimbabwe, and more than Kenya. Taxes are just put up every day. It's so ridiculous to a point where even blind people are taxed to go and buy whatever material, braille material that they need. People that have got problems with their eyesight, like myself, if I were buying my glasses in Zimbabwe, I will be taxed. And you expect a government to understand that these things are important for blind people to have. It's important for blind people to have braille material, but these are text. And I think when I look at Kenya, I think the Kenyan society has evolved since the days of Moi. They are no longer scared of the political elites the way that Zimbabweans are terrified of ZANU-PF. They are terrified of the military and the police. Recently, we had a general who came out, who's the commander of our army, saying that elections in Zimbabwe, they will use command voting, which means they will tell you who to vote for. So and there was no reaction from the top political leaders in Zimbabwe, in the opposition. Today I was talking to an African leader in East Africa who was asking me where civil society is in Zimbabwe. There was an element of civil society that we saw in Kenya. The Law Society president was active on social media, explaining to people issues, explaining the law, explaining that the police, what they're doing is not right. In Zimbabwe, we don't have that. The Law Society was captured a long time ago. From time to time, we've had people running the Law Society who are loyal to the current president. And so it's impossible to have civil society which is effective, as we saw in Kenya. It's impossible to have that in Zimbabwe because civil society has died in Zimbabwe. And I think the other problem that we've had in Zimbabwe is that in the past there's been a lot of support from other countries. But I'll give you a good example of how things went south for civil society, even in terms of funding. When Brexit happened, British government changed its priorities. So civil society movements that were funded by Western countries They stopped having that kind of funding because the world is changing. The West is interested in seeing how to counter the emergence of a Chinese superpower. So they are willing to cut deals with corrupt officials in African countries across the continent. So I think what it did, the Kenyan protests, they inspired Zimbabweans. I see certain people that were not talking about protests, now talking about protests. I see certain leaders that would not have gone onto the streets, now talking about going to the streets. I see certain professions, especially the media and the legal professions. I see a lot of discussions in WhatsApp groups about what happened in Kenya. Some people are actually ashamed that they belong to professions that are supposed to be at the forefront of making sure that Zimbabweans are able to exercise their rights, which include Section 59, protesting against the government, petitioning your government. But in Zimbabwe, it's difficult at the moment. We have got 79 people that were arrested on the 16th of June. They were celebrating the Youth Day, the 1976 Youth Day in South Africa, where students were killed demonstrating against the compulsory usage of Afrikaans as a language. One of the guys who was arrested, he's the owner of the place where these people were arrested. He's a former government minister. He has been in jail without bail, denied bail for almost a month now. And those are instruments that are used to instill fear in citizens. And when I looked at the Kenyan side, I realized that our Kenyan brothers and sisters have sort of breached that line of fear. Perhaps because this time it's not the politicians. I looked at Baba and what he's trying to do, his handshakes and all that. And the youths are saying it's not going to work this time. We're not doing it for you, we're doing it for ourselves. So I hope that this is a new spirit that will help Africans to fight against corruption. Corruption is endemic in Zimbabwe. But when you look at how it can be tackled, there's no other way now left except protests. Why I say so is because voting has failed. The elections are rigged. Even SADC, for the first time, said elections have been rigged, but nothing changes. So the only option now left for Zimbabweans, especially the young people who are jobless, who do not have access to healthcare, who do not have clean drinking water in their homes, is to go onto the streets. Let me just take you back to some of our historical, I would say, matches in terms of protests. So in the 1980s, 10 to 20,000 Zimbabweans were killed. And that has trauma. That trauma is still living with those people. They are scared. If you look at Kenya, people were being killed. Government ministers were being killed in Kenya under Daniel Arap Moi. People were being sent to jail. Some had to run out of the country. If you look at countries like Uganda, people like Dr. Stella Nyanzi have been to prison. She's had to run out of Uganda for her own safety and that of her family. So dictators at this point in time, they are really worried about what's going to happen after the Kenyan thing. I know in this particular space, there are a lot of Secret Service people from the Zimbabwean CIO listening, waiting for me to say something. And the next thing I'll hear, knock on my door, you are inciting citizens to protest, you go to prison. I've been to prison 3 times on false charges of incitement. They said I wanted to remove the government of the day. They said I wanted to incite people. I wanted people to be violent and remove the president violently. it's the same card that has been used across the continent, but it's now up to the young people of this continent to realize that change lies in their hands.
All right, thanks. Hopewell, I'm really sorry about what you've been going through in your work as a journalist. I mean, I've followed you quite closely. And speaking of that, young people in Zimbabwe will be demonstrating tomorrow. I think that's going on around in Harare, and they're going to be demonstrating, they say, against corruption, nepotism, poverty, and open repression. And someone just tweeted that they need ambulances and lawyers on standby in Zimbabwe tomorrow. They foresee arrest. Nicholas Opiyo is a human rights lawyer who has been observing different issues across the continent and also here in East Africa. Nick, what do we learn from the Kenyan protests?
Well, first of all, thank you to the first two speakers. I think that Ugandans in particular, and I think many African youth are inspired by what they saw in Kenya. If you read African protest histories, in the last 2 decades, you can say this is the third round of mass protests against autocratic leaders, starting with what was called the Arab Spring, that led to the fall of autocrats, largely in the Arab region, beginning from Ben Ali in Tunisia, down to Egypt, and in parts of North Africa. That in the last 2 decades was a major wave of protests. The second wave of protests are the ones that saw the fall of the Mugabes, that saw the fall of Omar al-Bashir, that was led really largely by the rise in new media, the role of civil society. In my view, from where I sit, I see a third wave that is generational. So I see this as a third wave of protest that is going to sweep across the continent, thanks to the event in Kenya. And these protests are slightly different in the sense that it appears to me to be generational. It is not conventional protests organized by civil society, organized by parties. Rather, this seems to be young people leveraging on first numbers, but also secondly on technology. And I see this inspiring protest across the continent. Uganda is planning one, as you said, tomorrow Zimbabwe has one. And so the first thing is that the Kenyan protests have emboldened people. And I think the response of the Kenyan government in part was responsible for that, because very rarely do you see African leaders folding to demands of citizens. The Kenyan president has walked back a lot of things, partly, I think, to save his skin, because he's seen the determination of the young people in Kenya. And so I see this sweeping across the continent eventually, majorly led by young people. But there's a second element to this, and you've got to distinguish between why the Kenyan protests have been largely successful as they can be, to the extent of forcing the hand of the heads of state. First is that this kind of protests tend to succeed in countries where there are no military leaders in charge of the country. Where there's a military leader in charge of the country, those people are always willing to kill their own citizens to keep themselves in power. I think largely Zimbabwe was also lucky in the Mugabe era. Mugabe wasn't a soldier, an ideologue, an African Pan-Africanist liberator. But in countries like Uganda, where the leader first, before becoming a politician, is a soldier, he will kill without blinking. There have been several episodes on the Ugandan streets where the Ugandan leader has sent out soldiers to kill innocent civilians protesting their government. Those in Uganda know about the 2009 Buganda protests. Others have called them riots, but many people think they were really just an uprising, was a protest. Peaceful, beginning from Kampala and spreading across central Uganda. Hundreds of lives were lost at the hands of state operatives, sometimes in the full view of the camera. In the last election in Uganda, the state wasted no time in November 18th and 19th to send soldiers on the streets to kill. And the president admitted to killing people on the streets. His own minister for security, his party functionaries, were not even shy to admit that they were going to kill. And indeed, they killed people. So in countries that are led by army men as politicians, protests tend to be very, very quickly squashed. You see how the Arab Spring failed in Egypt. Sudan was, al-Bashir was not a soldier. And so you have all this factor that you must. The second thing, in my view, is the geopolitical importance of the country. Kenya is nearly a regional capital. Kenya is an economic powerhouse. The governments tend to be hesitant to destroy their own investments, especially given that there's a long-serving history of rich, Kenyans and rich families. And so in those situations, protests tend to thrive. And that is coupled with the political history of the country. Uganda's history, protests are seen as uprisings. At least in Kenya, you can tell by how people were responding to protests from the post-Moi era. Protests have become some sort of a subculture in the Kenyan community. And so protests thrive in those conditions, broadly speaking. But there's a third thing that I see that the Kenyan protest will teach us, that protests must be specific in their demands for them to have broader appeal. The Kenyan populace was galvanized around a finance bill. It was simple, the message was clear that Kenyans were being taxed to the core. They were failed promises of the government that came into power just a few years ago. And so protests that have specific objectives and specific messages tend to have a lot of appeal to people who can identify with that kind of message. And that's why you have state functionaries trying to infiltrate protests because they want to create a situation where it looks as though there's stealing, it looks as though that there's robbery, there's unlawfulness to justify intervention. But when protests are specific and the people who go in to understand what it is, they tend to have a lot of success. And so I think in many ways, the Kenyan protests have taught Ugandans. You can argue that subsequently the protests appear to be spreading beyond the issues of the finance bill. You're now hearing echoes of Ruto must go, but they were most successful when they were specific and the people could identify with what they were protesting. And I think Ugandans have a lesson to learn, but also just a lesson, institutions must function. The Kenyan Law Society, I think that the Ugandan Law Society is in the same place as the Zimbabwean Law Society, an impotent, indolent, captured institution that cannot even defend its own members, leave alone defend the rule of law in a robust way in which the Kenyan Law Society is defending, the rights of people in Kenya. You also have, at least the judiciary, has stood up to the test. Many people have been released. The courts were quickly processing people who had gone through the system. So there's some measure of institutional response and independence. The Kenyan broadcasting regulator refused to shut down social media or to close the internet because they said it is the lifeline of the economy and their democracy. So there's a measure also of institutional functioning in Kenya in a way that was, I think, for many of us in Uganda, would provide lessons. I doubt if the Ugandan judiciary, the Ugandan Communication Commission can do the same thing that the Kenyans did. But there's a measure of institutional development, independence, that I think was enviable. And it has to do with, like John-Allan Namu said, the constitutional and institutional reforms that happened in the post-Moi era that gave Kenya the kind of institutions they have. The police chief in Kenya is not appointed by the president. It's really an interview process. It has an independent oversight body. And so you have some measure. But in countries like Uganda, where everybody is appointed by the president, it's quite difficult to exercise institutional independence. And we see what we have in Uganda is quite different. I hope and pray that the young people who are going to march in parliament on 23rd in Uganda take some lessons from Kenya and use it here in a way that can challenge what I see as a difficult, different environment from Kenya, but where there's at least some possibilities. Because if they show up in great numbers, young people, and make it fun, make it peaceful, I think that it will work. So I'll end it there, my dear brother.
All right, thanks a lot for that. I think you are right on point when you say that sometimes some institutions need to work. I think that we've had instances in Uganda here where a call just comes in and UCC switches off the internet. The Uganda Communications Commission for Continental Audience switches off the internet. I also saw that they had to go to court to actually allow the military to be deployed on the streets in Kenya. In fact, the Kenyan courts ruled, I think that was on the 28th of June, that the military force should come and try to restore order after the protests here in Uganda. It's just, you will see heavy deployment of soldiers and all that. And we've seen that in the past. I'm supposed to be having the Uganda Human Rights Commission here, but I can't seem to see them. And Robert as well, I can't seem to see you. In the next hour, I'll give an opportunity to you to be part of the conversation. I've seen many of the requests.
But my brother Solomon, Robert is the ED of the National Coalition for Human Rights Defender. I see his organization handle listening in. Perhaps that could be him.
Okay, maybe we can use that because I was trying to look out for his for his Twitter handle. Okay, thanks. Let me try to look out for him and then bring him on board. But Namu, what's the latest? The fact that, I think for me, that the fact that these protests yielded results is very important. The fact that President Ruto, even amidst a very the tense moments, the parliament was put up into flames. The judiciary, they attacked. The judiciary offices were set ablaze. Amidst all that, he caught a breath and, had his cabinet sit and make very, very serious recommendations and points of action. Does then, in Uganda, we've had protests and, some of our leaders just ignore them, But do you think that it also takes a listening leader to listen to what the people are saying? Did you feel that the protests yielded results after the Kenyan President William Ruto came and addressed the nation in terms of the recommendations that his government had set in place? John?
Yeah. What's happening in coming days is that there's going to be a government sort of organized dialogue, which Raila Odinga yesterday said he was going to be a part of, give a chance. He issued a very interesting tweet today after hearing the concerns of members of the public who had urged him to stay out of this. So I'm wondering whether that impacts his participation or his party's participation, although there's been a statement from the Orange Democratic Movement stating that they'd like to give dialogue a chance. There have been various sectoral leaders who are now, in meetings in preparation for that dialogue next week. But that's really the elephant in the room. Whether this dialogue, A, is even necessary, or will be accepted by the large majority of the people who went into the streets, and B, to your point about the kind of changes that were made, whether those changes, and I think one of the criticisms has been whether those changes needed protest at all to have been effected. A lot of them didn't require changes in law. A lot of them had been part of the national discourse in terms of the size of government, the unnecessary expenses. These are things that had been part of the national concern for a number of years, and the real, question that's hanging is whether dialogue is going to be successful if a good number of people do not believe that it's necessary. However, to your question about what's been achieved, yes, the president walked back the finance bill. Unfortunately, the appropriations bill, which is a twin of the finance bill, was signed, which essentially gives the executive the power to expense, right? And the impact of that is yet to be seen, but that's likely going to become a coming fight. But yes, there have been changes. There have been changes that have taken place. The president walked back a number of the things that he was thinking about. You've seen a more, apologetic political class, some going as far as printing T-shirts and posting themselves on TikTok and Instagram saying that they're sorry. A lot of the performance and I think this is another question, whether these apologies are contrite or they're performative. But another question just that will guide what's happening in days to come is the question of trust, right? So whether trust has been broken completely or whether there will be some sort of, stepping down or stepping back from the demands that are being made by the protesters, and actually dialoguing with the president. That's something that is yet to be seen. Right now, it seems as if that's not going to happen. The final thing I will say, Solo, is that, you see, in as much as the focal point of the protest has been the finance bill, right? And then that's since kind of moved on to matters corruption. There have been protests that have been staged in other parts of Kenya that focus on very specific issues to those parts of the country. And the recognition that, largely the political class, the leadership in those parts of that country or of our country, are largely responsible for that. So, for instance, yesterday there was one in, I believe, in Nandi County, and there were others elsewhere. This tells you that it's not going to be as easy as dialoguing and talking it out. There are really fundamental things that are going to change. They're going to have to change. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the other very big issue is the question of austerity, right? Which is staring us in the face as a possible measure, to be able to counter or to be able to manage our debts, right? Our Moody's rating was downgraded, although the politics around how African countries are classified financially is something that should have its own Twitter space. But that has a significant impact on Kenya's financial positioning, its reputation, its ability to borrow in coming days, and the impacts to the economy, given the kind of confidence that will have to be shored up again after Kenya's own public rejected the finance bill, is something that's going to have an impact in the medium to longer term. And then there's the fact that people are still struggling. So in coming days, there's a lot of stuff that's unclear. But in terms of the activities, it will be the dialogue that people will kind of be watching and seeing whether it takes as a remedy for the protest. But there are a lot of much larger questions that are going to shape discussion, debate, protest, and likely changes in the country in days to come.
All right, John, thank you very much. We will be closely following the developments in Kenya and see indeed how it will pan out and whether President Ruto will remain true to his word. I know that over the weekend there was a ceremony to remember those that lost their lives during the protests and during riots. Robert Kirenga, it's good to have you. Robert is the Executive Director of the National Coalition for Human Rights Defenders. Thanks for joining us, Robert. The conversation in the room is what lessons do we learn from protests in Kenya, but also where should protests start and stop? The right to protest, where does it start and stop?
Thank you, Solomon. I don't think I need to apologize because I've been on since from the start. I think you just didn't notice it. Thank you, Nicholas, for alerting him. I think the right to peaceful protest, or right to what we would rather call the right to peaceful assembly, is guaranteed on our legal regime, including the international regimes that we have ratified. And therefore, there is no excuse as to why Ugandans should not be able to exercise this right to peaceful protest. It's provided for under Article 21 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Uganda ratified. It's also provided for in the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda under Article 23, 1D. So we have all that provided in the laws. What I want to agree with is what my colleague Nicholas talked about. The kind of context or the regime that we have here, whether or not it accommodates citizens who intend or wish to exercise their right to peaceful assembly or protest. And of course, basing on what we are seeing and what we've been observing in terms of the institutional capture or decay, whether they are public institutions or civil society, and also looking at the levels of civic competence. I've been arguing with colleagues, you can't compare ourselves with Kenya. Even right from the time of fighting for independence, the struggle they went through to attain their independence cannot be compared to ours. No, the levels are completely different. And then we have a culture now. Sometimes I believe that these governance issues that we are trying to protest against, corruption, it looks like we are beneficiaries. Is indirectly, whether we benefit, because we are now good at lamenting as opposed to holding these leaders or our managers accountable. We are good at lamenting, but I also have some other pedestal argument, which I've always said, that the presence of food in this country, I think, makes us very comfortable. In Kenya, not more than 40% are able to afford 3 meals a day. In this country, food is available. Even to those who don't work, who have no jobs, who have no employment, they don't sleep an empty stomach. So every decision that they make that will have an impact on his or her livelihood here is not really felt like in the countries like Kenya. So we have a big challenge. But the hope that I have is the demographics that we are seeing, that currently young people are in charge of this society in terms of numbers. And these numbers continue to grow. And if there is no arrangement to keep them busy, to ensure that they're busy, then we are going to follow the Kenyan way. But it will take, for one to go to heaven, you really have to die. There are some who will have to sacrifice themselves. This struggle, as I told my colleagues in the Kenya National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders, that you need to recognize those young men and women who died in that struggle. Because hadn't they to die, maybe the system in Kenya would not have sat down and said, let's talk. So the challenge we have really here is the levels of civic competence. And we really need to see how we can empower young people to take charge of their future and instead empower them to know their rights, demand them, and defend them. Because these are human entitlements by virtue of the fact that you're a human being. These are entitlements. So you have the right to protest if you feel that something is not going well, because it's a very foundation of a system of participatory governance based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law and pluralism. So it also protects the ability of people to exercise your individual autonomy if you feel you are aggrieved, in solidarity with any other person who feels aggrieved. So come 23rd, we would want to see who are those who feel they are aggrieved as a result of this corruption, the malfeasance that is happening in these institutions such as like Parliament. So we will need to learn a lot from Kenya. And I know the system here, of course, must be watching. I've heard the executive has already warned anyone who attempts to do it. But depending on numbers, there is a limit as to how much the law enforcement can do with numbers. You saw young people in Kenya go into the institutions of State House, and they shot and they kept on taking cover and moving forward. Numbers matter. So the level of mobilization, the level of civic competence is very key in as far as how we can draw lessons from Kenya. And of course, our institutions, the kind of people that occupy these offices and the way that they have been appointed is also wanting. If in Kenya you saw that the army was very reluctant. It took the institution of parliament to invite the army to go on the street and to protect, not to kill citizens. In our case, the military police, I think, would be the first to make the shots. And I'm not sure whether we are courageous enough or we have the numbers really that will cause them to withdraw back to Makinde barracks. Thank you.
I know, because we've seen that happen in the past. We've seen that happen in the past in this country. If you've just joined us, we are having a continental conversation on the right to protest, and we're learning some lessons from Kenya. It's your time to talk back. It's your time to make a contribution. It's your time to give us your thoughts and views. What lessons do we learn from Kenya all across Africa? I'll give you an opportunity to share. And once I give you the mic, you can indeed at least take at least 2 minutes, so that we can have different speakers join. And all of us, we can share our thoughts. Let me start with Mr. Daniel. Mr. Daniel Wabwire, you're welcome.
Here in Kenya, I can say good evening. Yeah.
Good evening.
Yeah. I have some submission that I have to make concerning the topic. I think the main agenda that brought us together as Gen Zs, Millennia, Gen X was about our movement was tribalist, where no leader could use that as a weapon to incite community against another. And that one played a very big part on our success. It was not about carrying on mobilization. We came together for the same purpose, which is affecting everybody. Financial bill was just a catalyst. And that is the reason why we are still on the struggle. Because there are a lot of things that need to be looked into. Issue like corruption, issue like unemployment, and tribal lines. That is what we are trying to sort out. What I will encourage my fellow countrymen, neighbors from Uganda and all over the world is that when you stand together, you can overcome any dictator in the world. They say when we have power, when we don't fear anything, this dictator thrives on fear. When you are fear, if you are fear, if you anything that they say, you bend on their command, they will take that advantage. They will continue to mismanage, to doing their dirty deals, dirty businesses, and to continue manipulating everybody. I just want to thank the effort that activists are making in Uganda, in other parts of Zimbabwe, and even in Nigeria, coming together to fight for your right. In Kenya, it is outlined in our constitution. Everybody should look at their rule of law and practice accordingly. Human rights, even journalists, everybody come together and you fight the same cause. That is just my small submission.
All right, thanks, Daniel Wabwire there speaking to us from Kenya. Thank you very much. Cynthia, you're welcome.
Thank you, Solomon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Thanks for having me. Well, I've been listening in, and I've had the contributions of previous speakers, especially when it comes to the dangers involved in participating in protests in Uganda. And I have to acknowledge and recognize that participating in protests in Uganda carries inherent risks, and anyone attending the 23rd July peaceful protest to Parliament must be prepared to accept these dangers. Nevertheless, we emphasize that this will be a peaceful protest, and we urge the men and women in uniform to acknowledge this and fulfill their duty to protect the interests of all Ugandans on that day. Definitely, we hope to notify the police and cooperate with the police, and we hope that the police will maintain peace. And I'm being very optimistic right now, but we can only hope for the best, because we know obviously Uganda's political landscape differs from Kenyan's more progressive democracy. But definitely the demand to end corruption is inevitable, and we've had different actors in Uganda politics that have contributed hugely to making us aware of the necessity and urgency that is required for Ugandan citizens to stand up and take action against corruption, as our leaders have failed us in this area. And for the success of this protest, we only hope that Ugandans will unite, and we also hope for a positive response from the government, because usually we know the government usually retaliates in a violent and brutal manner. So as Ugandans, we will be marching against corruption on that day, and we appeal to the humanity of the Uganda police force to acknowledge that corruption affects them too, not just us.
All right.
Okay, yes. Nicholas earlier said that the Kenyans had a specific demand, and our demand in Uganda is also very simple. We all know that corruption is taking place, and we only want an end to corruption. Yes, and that's all. And I hope this is a reason that resonates with mostly all Ugandans. That's all. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Cynthia. Charles Ogira?
Yes, thank you so much, Solomon, and all the listeners. First and foremost, I must say that the protest in Kenya has really set a new trend for all the youth across several divides across East Africa and, of course, beyond. But my fear is that, one, we are operating in a military regime that from our inception to power or to government, they held a gun on anything that would deter them from capturing power. And the surge, the LRS surge in northern Uganda, redirected the democratic trends of Uganda in a manner that it is subjected people into complete state of desolation, fear, and apathy. And it groomed in us, where we can't even question certain actions of our own parents if we know that what they do to us is wrong. Instead, we have to obey. We have to commit to whatsoever thing that they tell us. Also, the civil society network in Kenya is a very strong one. They have a very strong cobweb network that working hand in hand with the civilians, with the people, to ensure that they challenge the democratic, the constitutional issues in their countries, the human rights violations in their countries. And it is not the case in Uganda. Much as civil society have tried, I would arguably say it is probable that some civil society organizations are in bed with the state because they have failed to speak up on the critical issues that affect the people. We have failed to see civil society leaders come and say, let us be the ones to hold the placards and front ourselves to Parliament. We instead want to, mobilize people to come together for the usual workshops, capacity building and trainings, but we have failed as civil society network to put into tangible and workable approaches that vividly make us come at the forefront, and so the rest of the civilians or the protesters who do not have a backing to follow us. If we are to come first, then the rest of the civilians in every other pockets of the country will say yes. The fact that we have the civil society organizations coming first, telling us, let's do this, they have trained us, yes, they have empowered us, let's do this all together, it will work. But it's a situation where Karamoja is facing its own problem. No, Gulu or northern Uganda, say later, Gulu facing their own problem. Tororo. I mean, we have our unique challenges, which are state managed to, position us in a situation that we can never raise our head or our hands beyond what we feel we should condemn. And we have failed to identify a common advocacy issue that we should front as a people, say to parliament. The very last one is, of course, the arms of government. They are not working hand in hand. You find that the executive has cordoned the parliament, of course, the policymakers, and the judiciary is also acting in line with what these people expect them to do, the military regime, of course. So it will make us somehow fail to achieve what we want as a country until we are able to redraw our paths, become intentional, get angry enough like we have never before. We may not achieve what we desire as a country. Thank you so much, but I appreciate you for all the time putting into measures that can make us speak up as a people. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks a lot. Charles Ogira, thank you. Charles is a human rights defender and also a lawyer. Thanks a lot. Let me bring in Mr. Tumwesije. Mr. Tumwesije Humphrey, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Solomon. Always a pleasure being with you on this space, and I hope we learn 2 or 3 things from this. Solomon, you are telling us the right to protest, and you are asking us the lessons we learn from Kenya. Now, Solomon, when you look at the 2010 Kenyan Constitution, you look at the 1995 Ugandan Constitution, you realize that we all have documents called the Constitution, but the two provide with us different issues. Now, when you look at the 2010 Kenyan Constitution, it gives institutions in Kenya their independence. That's why you find the president of Kenya will go addressing the press and say that he has the most incompetent IGP. Why does he say that? He says that because the IGP is independent from the president. So he knows he has no control over the president. So if you compare with Uganda, what I can say that in Uganda, we were betrayed long time ago in 1995 by the makers of our constitution. You will find that if it's the security, the constitution will tell you that the commander-in-chief is the president. That means he has control over the army, he has control over the police, he has control over everyone, all the armed forces. So there is even no a single day where the army commander, the IGP, or the commissioner of prisons can take an independent decision not to send the army to the streets. Now, when you come to Uganda, what is that common cause that we are looking at? The Kenyans had a law that was affecting all of them, and they decided to come together. But in Uganda, as people are saying on 23rd, we are all coming to go to parliament. Do you know that there are some people who have benefited as a result of that corruption, and they will not even get bothered to go to parliament because to them they have benefited from that corruption. Now, when you look at our own Uganda UCC here, do you think the MD of UCC will even take a minute not to switch on that internet? Because his allegiance is where? His allegiance is to the executive. So whereas we must learn from the Kenyan protests, we must appreciate which landscape or which country are we in. I appreciate my brother Nicholas Opiyo, what he said at the start, that when you're under the rule of military man, the military man will not hesitate to shoot to kill in a minute. So we must also understand that when Ruto came in as the president of Kenya, Ruto came in with this new constitution of Kenya, and Ruto is a civilian. So you cannot look at a civilian president the same way you look at a military president. So as Ugandans prepare for 23rd to go to parliament, we must understand that we are dealing with a government that is military. We are dealing with a government that will not hesitate to shoot and kill you. We are dealing with police that is itself disgruntled. They will get their anger and put it on the citizens. So before we make any attempts to march to parliament, we must appreciate the Ugandan that we are in, because we were betrayed by our people in 1995 who decided to get all the powers under the constitution and give it to the president. The Chief Justice cannot even stand and make a decision on his own. The president is now acting as a state of execution. There will be a court order. The president will call the Chief Justice and tell him, please overturn this decision. So before you decide to march to parliament, and before you go for this protest, know the landscape that we are playing on and try to understand the scenario we're in here in Uganda, well knowing that we are playing with a military man. I saw a tweet from...
All right.
Thank you so much.
As you conclude.
Yes, as I conclude, I saw a tweet from the Speaker of Parliament saying that she has always been a person who listens and wants to engage with people. If she really means what she says, let her go on Twitter and say that on 23rd, she's willing to meet the protesters and listen to them and talk about this corruption. Let's not have this. Solomon, my conclusion is, before as Ugandan, as the youth, before we protest to parliament, let us understand that our landscape in Uganda is totally different from the Kenyan landscape, and our institutions are not independent as Kenyan institutions. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks a lot for that. Interesting. Your views, your comments, your contributions are appreciated. We have Thamsanga. You're very welcome, Thamsanga.
Thank you so much, my brother. I don't usually speak on these forums, but I just thought that it is important to provide some balance, probably what I would call a voice of caution. And I will give you a few examples. Number one, I would like to believe, as I understand, that what you call a success in the protest in Kenya over the finance bill was because President Ruto, my understanding is he conceded and backed down because he wanted to save lives, having learned lessons from 2007, 2008. And at that time, as you would appreciate, he was dragged to The Hague together with former President Uhuru. Those that are in Kenya who'd want to be reminded of the events of 2007 and 2008. So my understanding is that the president conceded because he did not want the situation to deteriorate until things were out of control and lives were being lost. So, but if I give you an example of the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, three countries where demonstrations and protests are held, and the constitutions of these countries are what most of African countries are modeled on when we speak about the right to protest. So you'd realize that in the United Kingdom, millions of people demonstrated against the war in Iraq, but none of them dared to cross the line into the House of Parliament or to Buckingham Palace. Why? Because there are consequences to crossing that line. It's okay if you exercise your right to protest, but there are limits to the right to protest. If you remember, in America, people were marching and protesting over George Floyd and other things. That was fine as long as they were not crossing the line. January the 6th, during the Trump protest, the minute some people crossed that line and stormed the Capitol Hill, the army in America was brought in. Lives were lost. And the same thing happens in France. France, they demonstrate and they protest almost every weekend. They go to designated areas. They don't disturb business. They do it at specific times. They do it within what is allowed by law to make sure that they don't disrupt the lives of others that don't want to be part of those protests. None of those in France would demonstrate thousands and hundreds of thousands almost every week, or weekend, should I say, dare to go to the AIIJ or cross into parliament. Why? Because the minute you do that, even in France, there are serious consequences when the army is brought in. So I think we need to be very cautious and say the right to protest is within the constitutions of all the African countries. But the minute you cross the line, the minute you try to overthrow a government, there might actually be consequences. And those consequences will be the same, whether you're in Kenya, you're in Uganda, you are in America, you are in France, you are in the UK, or any other country that you might think about in the world. So I just thought that let me come in and sound a caution and say, do in Kenya what you do in America. Do in Uganda what you do in the UK. The UK, you would not demonstrate and be allowed to storm Buckingham Palace. Anyone who knows and understands countries and the security of the nations will tell you that that's something that can't be done. So I urge our brothers to be responsible, those that have influence, those that are organizing whatever protest. If you're organizing those protests, don't put other people's children at risk and within your rights, knowing the limits, but know that trying to overthrow a government will come with consequences. And we don't want those consequences to include loss of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have rights to protest, but we must do it within certain confines. Thanks a lot for that. That's interesting. We've also noted that down. Great insights there. Thamsanga, thank you. John, I'll come to you. Agatha Tuhaire, you're welcome, Agatha. Karibu.
Hi, Solomon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Good evening to you and everyone on this space. I think it's a very important space. I think I'll start from what the last speaker said that caught my attention when he talks about crossing the line and consequences. Who determines that line? Because it happens all the time where these authoritarian regimes will claim that people wanted to overthrow a government. It's what happened in Kampala in November 2020, the incident that Nick alluded to. So who decides that a line has been crossed? That's a gray area right there. But I think why I thought I want to say something on this space is that the lessons from Kenya maybe shouldn't be about the right to protest, should be what we as Ugandans can do to rebuild, restore structures and institutions. I think the reason Kenya had successful protests that with minimal damage, I am sure if those happened here, we wouldn't even count the dead bodies in Uganda here. So we saw things that for us as Ugandans were very strange. We had never seen that the parliament of Kenya the approval of parliament was first sought to, for example, deploy the army on the streets. I think in Uganda it has become so normal for the army to be everywhere. Many times where I pass to go to the school of my children and back, there's a roadblock all the time, a military one, and they're always asking, why is the army on the street? They're asking because they're just seeing it. For us, we've seen it so many times that it's now so normal. We don't even ask. We just see them. It's just a military city, a military country. But I had the government of Kenya in parliament seeking this approval. And I said, imagine this is not even a government trying to deploy their army outside their country, but they have to seek approval. And you saw how the court refused at first, and there was this back and forth. That can never happen here. It cannot. The military will be on the streets and will kill at will, like they did, like they have several times. Go to the regulators, the communication regulatory authority there that refused to shut down the internet. There's no way this can happen here. Look at how the protesters were interacting with the security. Here you're going to get a bullet in your head even without doing anything. The people that were killed on the streets in 2020 included a retiree that was going about his business, Kamiati, who was vending food and all that. So you look at that, you look at how courts in Kenya work, how the parliament in Kenya works, how these other institutions work, and here they don't. So the people that, the protest that is being planned right now, I am sure people are ready for whatever comes. I think some of them will first even write their wills or something. I think it's Robert who talked about the sacrifices we should be willing to make. So I hope there are those that are willing to make that sacrifice, because I think things will have to change in this country, and it's just a matter of time that at the end of the day, we will have no choice but to fight back in whatever way we can. I am glad we have seen a bit of progress in that, in people's resolve to push back and demand and ask questions. I'm glad we've had the Kenyans to, look up to and say that there's an example here. But I would like to also tell governments, like how the former speaker came to caution those that want to push back or protest. I would like to also tell governments that it would never have to get to that. When people are talking about issues that are going wrong, we should have governments that listen to that should be willing to account. But if they don't, I think it's just a matter of time that people will, feel pushed to the wall. They can't afford life, like Robert Kirenga once said. Ugandans can't afford life. Kenyans saw that they were reaching a point where they were not going to afford life and thought that the only option they have is to do what they had to do. So yeah, thank you for this space once again. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Agatha, for that, and as well for holding similar conversations. Much appreciated. I'll give an opportunity to 3 or 4 more people, and then I go back to my panelists. Evans, Karibu.
Asante sana, Solomon. Very interesting speeches here and deliberations. I've had the privilege to actually visit Uganda. I am Kenyan and I currently live in Finland, so I probably have a wider spectrum of looking at not solely protest, but how progressive societies work and what makes them tick. So listening to a couple of conversations here, especially I think the speaker before the lady, who talked about the fact that, there are certain places that you can't go to, and there are certain institutions that you can't talk about or you can't criticize. If you look at history, if you go down to history, most of these, like for example, European societies, the American societies, there were bloody protests in the 19th century and going up to the earliest 20th century. So we are talking about societies that have matured by bloodletting, that have matured by pouring blood. If you look at the history of Kenya, we are now looking at what is happening now didn't just not come out of the blue. There have been protests, if you remember early 90s when it was a one-party state and when the people were fighting for multipartyism, there was a lot of blood that was poured. If you go way back to Mau Mau, so we are. I would say that right now we are living in different times because, of course, we have the way we communicate is different. I mean, if it was back in the day, you would hear that there was a protest in Nairobi, maybe after 3 days or something. But now, you know that something is happening right now. You are equipped with information. You can get information on a tap. You are language is broken down so that so many people can understand how the countries are run and what is not being done right. So to say that that some of this protest or the right to protest at what is happening in Kenya now has come as in the recent past weeks would be wrong. This is a culmination of a culture that has been cultivated over time when it comes to protesting. And I think my friend John-Allan would back me up to say that a lot of people have died. The reason why it seems that now, because of course young people are being killed, young people are aware of how the countries run. I am a millennial. I'm on the apex of a millennial and a generation X. So we lived in the President Moi era. We were children, and then we transitioned to the Kibaki Uhuru era, and now we are in Ruto's era. So if you look at what has happened over time, is that we have, as Kenyans, we have consistently fought for justice. We have consistently, I mean, the terrain has not been easy. There's this joke that goes around that a Kenyan can survive anywhere in the world. I mean, Helsinki, it gets to minus 50 here. But the truth is that this fight is just reaching the apex of it right now. But it has been here before. I was in Uganda. I've been to Uganda maybe 3 times. And I'm a psychologist, so when I go to places, I have a third eye to things and the way I can see things. So I have the Kenyan band, the Kenyan flag in on my wrist. And the moment, I remember I was in a hotel and I had a shirt that was covering it. And the moment I sort of rolled back my shirt and a Ugandan saw my band, the mood changed right away. And later when I talked to them and asked them what was that about, then it was like the notion is that I could be a spy. So there is something called public psyche control. And a public psyche control is what, it's actually a military war, I would call it a war tactic that can be used to control populations. So you can be sold fear that probably doesn't exist. You can be sold fear that a few people will be put down and then you're told the rest of the population, this is what will happen to you if you do certain things. The things that are happening in Kenya are no more less than what would happen in Uganda. But what has happened over time in Kenya is that we have consistently educated ourselves and refused to be controlled by the politicians. Of course, it comes with a price. And even the young people, as you say, the lady was saying that if you try to protest now, everybody will be shot. But the politicians cannot kill everybody in the country who will pay the money that they want. So we have had 40 people being killed, 40 young people being killed, as I think those are the tallies as by yesterday. But we've had more people killed. Actually, just this year, when the opposition was fighting for the amendment of the IBC, there were people killed. People were being the police were going into people's home and dragging them out and shooting them in front of their families. It's not long ago. It's just that we forget things very fast. But what I wanna say as a Kenyan who lives in the diaspora is that what our young people are saying now in Kenya is that it's no longer the person who is sitting at the top. It's the constitution that is the leader. If you have a good document and the citizens can consistently press the politicians to adhere to the constitution, then that becomes the leader. Because why this protest has been so magnanimous is because there is nobody to negotiate with. There's nobody to blame. There is no one, somebody sitting at the top and saying, yes, I am the leader of this protest. People are saying the problems are the instigators and the constitution is the direction. So I am, when I'm listening to especially our brothers from across the border speaking, it emanates from years and years of being psychologically controlled and told that if you do this, this will happen. But the power always remains with the people. And if people would rise up, know their rights, step on the streets, and start speaking boldly, nobody can outlive the people. Because the people is the movement, and the people are the power. People are the country. So it's not about Kizza Besigye. I remember him. It's not about, I don't know any other prominent opposition guy in Uganda. I remember only Kizza Besigye. But if it is the Ugandan people, eventually the Ugandan people will prevail. Thank you so much, Solomon. Thank you. I yield back.
Asante sana, tunashukuru. Evans, thank you very much for your submissions. I'll give 3 more people and then go back to my panelists. I see we have about 10 minutes. Salani, you're welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Solomon. I really appreciate it. And what a fantastic space. I just wanted to say a couple of things. And I'm from Zimbabwe. So what I'm going to speak to is basically use Zimbabwe as a case study in my submission. I think that will make more sense to even those who will be listening. So I saw everything that happened in Kenya, and I have to be honest. That was I want to thank the Kenyans for what the efforts they put in. And one thing that resonated that I noticed from them was the fact that when they were dealing with the finance bill, it had to do with them finding common goal. One thing about protests is that it has to be something that unifies us all, a situation where everybody could see themselves in that finance bill. They could see the problems it would cost them and cause when it came to their various situations. And that is what you were playing for us earlier in the space. So from that common issue that they were all now facing, each one of them, wherever they come from, whichever tribe, language you speak, you could see yourself that this was going to be a problem for you as well. Now, in Zimbabwe, we kind of have this mentality of saying, that translates to someone else's problem will not make me not eat food or sadza, so to say. And that's a big problem because that means there's a bit of selfishness in it, that if it does not touch me and my house, then I'm not going to get involved. And this is a problem I've seen regularly when it comes to the way in which Zimbabweans are dealing with these issues, and a lot of them, for that matter of fact. And what the problem you have there now is that if everyone feels that way, we've had doctors who've needed pay rise, we've had teachers who've needed pay rise, they've all held protests. But guess what? They've had little to no people that have supported them. Whether it's fellow Zimbabweans coming in and saying, oh, yes, if a doctor's not being paid right, that can affect us. There's not that kind of thinking to say they need to be paid right so that we can receive the best medical attention we have. And the moment you have that problem where someone thinks of themselves, you will see a situation whereby even if you wanted to call for a protest, who's going to join? Because there's no unity. Unity is the first recipe that you need for any protest to be successful. You need to be united in a cause that you're standing for. And I feel truly, when it comes to my country, we are so lacking in that. And I truly hope that we can work out how we can find each other. Because what the Kenyans showed us was that they are Kenyan first before anything else, right? And this is something I've said to even anyone in any country from Africa. You are from that country first before anything else. Before your political jacket, before your profession, before anything, you have to remember what it means to be Zimbabwean, Kenyan, Ugandan, you name it. And then that will give you that unity of purpose for you to come together. Now, another thing that I've also noticed is that people want to follow individuals. It's not about the issue. It's about, okay, there is this problem whereby our healthcare system is not working correctly. They want to wait for someone they see as popular with them, like someone who says the right things. They want to see that individual leading something. If anyone else who they don't know, but you know that what they're standing for is right, they won't follow them. Why? Because you do not believe in that person, or you don't follow them, or they're not as popular, on social media as you'd like them to be. And that doesn't work, because just being popular on social media does not mean you are the right person to get the job done. So it becomes an issue of personalities. It's no longer about the protest, the issues that they're protesting about. It's about who is leading it. And if you do not have a politician or someone who's in opposition politics that is leading something, you won't see anyone showing up. So you see that the whole mentality of why a protest should be done is losing its purpose. And of course, the regime is very repressive. Yes, it is. But if the people are to stand united on a cause, not on individualism, not on politics of saying, I will stand with this political party, I won't stand with that political party. If we put that aside and just dealt with the issues first, to make sure that Zimbabwe is working right, I think we'd get to a point where we could all start to see these type of protests that are starting to make waves all over the world. In my closing sentiment, all I would ask is that citizens have to remember that protests are not just a thing that happens once in every 10 years. It has to be a regular process, right? You've got a right to protest. You can't tell me there's no problems in your country. And on top of it, you also have to exhaust the avenues that have been given. Imagine holding a protest when you know that you could be talking to these people, you could be finding other ways. But if all that has failed, then you take it to the streets and say, okay, we did what we had to do. We tried to talk to these people. We tried to get to a consensus, but no, it hasn't worked. You've exhausted everything. Then you lead the protests. So if you start to get that kind of mentality, I think it'll work better. And also to just keep on repeating this phrase to say, protest all the time. Don't just wait for those type of situations after 5 years and you say, okay, let's enter the streets. You need to gain momentum. You need to get it. You also have to raise awareness with people. There's some people who don't even understand what they should do during a protest. Tell them what you intend to do. Also, you don't just enter into a street knowingly. Find out what people are protesting about, right? Get to a point where you understand. Do you resonate with it? If you resonate with it, definitely join them. But I feel people need to really think about why they enter into a protest. Don't just do it because other people are doing it. And also, I pray that the police, the army, the governments, let them allow citizens to protest because it is our right. Thank you so much, Solomon. I'll end there.
Wow, thanks a lot. Salani, you've really broken it down really well. And what a way to conclude the reactions from the audience. Nick, let me start with you. You've just heard it from the audience and, people giving their feedback and reactions. Any comments or any additions to the topic or to the conversations? Nicholas, karibu.
Thank you very much. I wish I knew Swahili. I would answer you back in Swahili. But I just wanted to say this. To the young people who are organizing the march in Kampala this month, don't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged by the warnings about inherent risks and the ability of the state to kill. I think the power of your ideas is what should drive you. And sometimes you start by little actions. If you're peaceful, and you guard against infiltration of that movement, I think you deserve to be listened to. Keep organizing, keep trying to stay within the bounds of the law. And I think that even if the protest is blocked, the idea that you could think about it is powerful. Let that idea marinate, let that idea germinate, let that idea eventually will come and carry the day if it's a powerful idea. The second thing to say is this, that the only thing that these leaders have over our head is fear. And they use that because, we fear going to jail, we fear going to the police cell. But if you disabuse yourself of that fear and take going to jail as a normal thing, as long as you're still alive, I think that should be disempowering to the leaders, because politicians are like bicycle tires. They respond to pressure. If you want to wait until the next election, you're going to be doing your country a disservice. Power doesn't give. Power is forced to give. So you must keep them honest, keep their feet on fire, and protest is a powerful tool of reasserting the sovereignty of the people of a country. To let leaders know that they only exercise delegated authority for and on behalf of the people that elected them and placed them in office. People don't exercise power as a right. People must be able to protest their leaders in whatever form, shape, or manner. And protests must defy the limitations of power that seeks to disable. Because you see, if you want to protest me, and my office is in Kololo in Kampala, the police or the authority cannot tell you to go to Munyonyo or go to Nambole Stadium. That, in effect, is making my protest ineffective. The role of the authority is to facilitate minimum inconvenience for other people and allow those who are peacefully protesting to protest. I hope they understand. And the idea that there are people who are breaking the law, those people must be isolated. And the people who are peacefully protesting allowed to protest. To the young people, power to you, go on, stay peaceful, stay within the law, you will be well. Thank you, Solomon.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick, for that conclusion. John-Allan, karibu.
Well, I mean, a lot has been said on the space about how protests happen, and I can't pretend to be, an expert on this. I've covered protests. I as a journalist, I've covered them for some time, but I can't, pretend to be an expert. I think what has been said about crossing the fear barrier is really important and instructive, right? So, in terms of statecraft, there are a few things that a politician or a leader usually wields. One is money, the other is influence, in terms of the influence that they have with the population. But just like Mr. Opiyo said, the third and perhaps the one that African leaders have relied on the most is the monopoly of violence and the use of fear to try and force people to do things when they can't be convinced. Now, you have to juxtapose that against the time in which we live. So in as much as I've heard a number of Zimbabwean speakers here talk about just that lack of unity and the lack of, seeing this as a struggle of, common goals, right, and of common cause. A few months ago in Kenya, even a few weeks ago, you couldn't have been convinced that this would have happened, that there'd be such a massive movement against a specific issue, in as much as there had been anger about the finance bill. There had been anger before, and in fact, there have been many takes that the finance bill from last year was actually more insidious than the one from this year, right? But there are certain points and certain confluences that happened in Kenya that allowed for these things to take place. So I don't think, and another thing, just to to respond to some of that, the 2022 election was perhaps one of the most studied in terms of the impact of apathy, right, on the selection of leaders in Kenya. Specifically the youth, the young population, were really browbeaten for having stayed away from the election. A good majority of people just didn't vote. And the assumption had always been that these guys just aren't connected, they don't care about what's happening, etc., etc. The protest has swept aside assumptions that we've held about our population in a matter of weeks. So what might be bubbling under the surface right now in Zimbabwe or in Uganda or elsewhere where these problems exist is something that people aren't really paying attention to. One lesson that I've learned from a colleague of mine is that you really need to pay attention to the places where that people spend their time and their money and their effort. It might be in the church, it might be at the bar, it might be elsewhere, right? But you really need to start paying attention to what's happening in those spaces and those really pernicious impacts that people don't talk about, that then can maybe help you start to look at where things are going. But as for Africa, I think that we really are at a very important moment in our history. Now, a moment seems fleeting, and maybe moment is the wrong word to characterize it, but perhaps maybe phase is better. We are facing some of the most serious challenges as a young population, where there is no path forward that's being offered by leadership. And this is true in so many countries. And what is the one of the worst things that you can tell a young person is that they don't have a future. What do they have to look forward to? And this is a young population that's seeing these kinds of things happening. You look at what's happening in West Africa with a number of military coups, etc. There have been a lot of criticisms of these countries for relying on the military. But perhaps what they look at the military as is a better alternative to the kind of ineptitude that they've seen in leadership. So that in itself is also a response to the kind of ineptitude that we see elsewhere. This is really also a moment for the current crop of leaders to really wake up and look around them and see what has become of their country and really take important steps to be able to ensure that things change for the common person going forward. It's really an important time. And if Kenya can be that example for the rest of the continent, then I think the job that Kenyans will have done in terms of trying to chart forward a much more positive future for Africa will then be something that we can talk about and boast about, other than our marathon records. It's really something that hopefully will become something to be spoken of with pride. And in coming days, if everything goes well, and there really is a much more robust shift in the country, then this is something that I hope other African countries can look to. But as it stands, things are still very fluid, so it's very tough to see into the future. But thank you very much to everybody who's been listening on the space, to the Ugandans, I can't remember how to pronounce that, but yeah,
you did well.
You get you get my drift. Have a good evening.
You did well. Thank you, John-Allan. Thank you. Robert, you have the final say at this.
Thank you, Solomon. Thank you, my fellow panelists, and thank you, colleagues who have been listening in. Personally, I resonate with the peaceful protests. I think the right to peaceful assembly is included and enshrined in our constitution, so we are not committing any crime. I cannot discourage or stop anybody from participating in this peaceful assembly. Life is about taking risks, and it's all about how you mitigate these risks. When you wake up out of your bed and get out of your house and jump on a border, you are taking a risk. And no one is going to change this country for the better other than we, the citizens, waking up. Democracy and human rights have never been provided on a silver platter. It's up to us to take the mantle. What I would advise whoever is going to participate, including myself, in this protest is that we need to have the right slogans to send out a message to whoever is not part of us, that enough is enough with corruption and poor service delivery. And there should be other strategies beyond this peaceful assembly, where we could name and shame all that we know are deemed corrupt on all platforms that we can access. Avoid any investments that we think belong to the rich, whether they are hotels, whether they do not have any engagements there. Let them be listed, and then we'll make it very difficult for someone to be associated with any corrupt deals. Thank you very much.
Robert Kirenga, thank you very much. John-Allan Namu and Nicholas Opiyo, and every one of you who has taken some time of today to really be part of this very great conversation. I appreciate you so much. 2 hours of quality discussion, over 2,000 people listening in at a go is really a voice that Africa really needs and deserves a change. It's really been an honor hosting you. My name is Solomon Serwanja. Good night, Africa, and good night, everyone. I'll see you again on another space. Good night and God bless.